Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišák, and I work as the deputy head of the foreign desk at the Slovak daily Pravda, which by the name means truth, and is not the Russian Pravda. Many Europeans worry that US President Donald Trump may be unwilling to help them in the event of Russian aggression. Does Taiwan have similar concerns regarding Trump's commitment in the face of China? And why does it seem that Beijing is ultimately turned to coercion instead of trying to win Taiwanese hearts and minds? In this episode of Global Agora, I speak with Jun Li, Associate Research Fellow at the Institute for National Defense in Taipei. We met at the annual CE Asia Forum in Bratislava, organized by the Central European Institute of Asian Studies and the Slovak Foreign Policy Association, where I moderated a panel titled Friends in Need, Friends Indeed, where is Europe-Taiwan cooperation headed? Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. You can find the link in the description of this episode. And now, on to the new debate. So let's start with something very recent. Last week, three countries, Madagascar, Mauritius, and Seychelles, revoked permission for Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te planes to transit their airspace. It is believed that they have acted at China's request, as Lai wanted to visit Eswatini, Taiwan's last remaining diplomatic partner in Africa. What do you think of these tactics by Beijing?
I think in recent years, we gradually realized that China has been changing its tactics against Taiwan. In the past, it was widely believed that China's ultimate goal is to win over Taiwanese people's minds and hearts. But I think since Xi Jinping's second term onwards, the Chinese authority now appears that they just want to coerce Taiwan, regardless of whether or how Taiwanese people perceive of its actions. So I think the Chinese authority was clear that such intervention, preventing our president from visiting our diplomatic allies, is not going to be very popular in Taiwan, not even amongst the opposition party supporters. But the Chinese authority just did that anyway. And I think we also have plenty examples such as Chinese coercion in the maritime domain, Chinese air and sea incursions nearly on a daily basis, and so on and so forth. So I think this is just one recent example of Chinese coercion. And this also reflects the growing confidence of China about its own power, its own strength, and its own influence.
So why this shift? You said that this is about China's own strengths and influence, but still I would argue that it's better to win the hearts and minds, not just to coerce people. But do you think that Beijing will simply continue with what it is doing now?
I think so. I think there are several factors to explain why China may have changed its tactics. I think one and a structural level is that statistics and polls have pointed to the direction that while in terms of political identity, that is whether Taiwan should maintain the status quo or move towards independence or unification, the majority of the Taiwanese people supports the idea of maintaining the status quo. But when it comes to cultural identity, namely whether the Taiwanese people are Chinese or Taiwanese or both, a long-term trend has been that more and more people now identify themselves as Taiwanese and Taiwanese only. So I think this is somehow a warning for the Chinese authority because they know that with time, the younger generations may have little and little interest in identifying or seeing themselves as culturally Chinese or ethnic Chinese. So that is one structural factor. And the other, I think, more political factor is that the DPP, the ruling political party, the DPP has been in power for 3 consecutive terms. And President Lai Ching-te went his first term in 2024. And that is a record because not single government or party has been able to secure the third term in Taiwanese political history. And I think while people may have different explanations for that election outcomes, I think what has been clear is that DPP can no longer be taken as a minority political party. Actually, it represents quite a lot of or significant part of Taiwanese people. So I think acknowledging this is also part of the reason why China now appears to weigh more on coercing Taiwan than on using those united front work or the so-called winning people's heart and minds measures. And third, I think China or the communist China basically believes in material power. And so when it comes to Taiwan, the question of Taiwan's identity, the classic calculation has been that the Taiwan question has to be determined as a result of US-China competition. And I think currently China still sees the United States as the main obstacle that prevents China from achieving national unification. And so if the calculation is that the US is still intervening in cross-strait relations anyway, then I think coercing Taiwan not only sends Taiwan a message, but it's also a gesture to the US.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation, I would say. And I will come back to the US role in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to add maybe an empirical observation from my side. I visited your country first time in 2008 and last time in 2024. And I think I can say that what you mentioned about the identity is very true. Of course, this is just my observation, but when I talked to in 2008 to people, yes, many of them were still like saying, yes, we are Chinese and so on. I think it has changed. And especially I talk to younger people because of the languages and so on. So I think, again, just my empirical observation, but I think it's very much confirmed by the polls. But one more question about China. At the beginning of March, there was a drop of Chinese activities in Taiwan's air defense identification zone. There were a lot of speculation what's going on. But how is the situation now? I think this is back to normal, if we can say the word normal.
Since mid-March, the PLA resumed its nearly daily incursions into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, or the ADIZ. The numbers of the sorties and the frequencies, I think, are lower than the average in the previous 2 or 3 years. So I think on the one hand, it seems that now the PLA's incursions are back to normal, so to speak. But on the other hand, the intensity is still lower than that in the previous years. And we are still struggling as to finding what is the main explanation. And I think there are 7 accounts, but I'm not going to repeat all of them. But I think the most plausible explanation appears to be that the PLA has been changing its training. So it is now moving towards joint exercise and also joint training. So in other words, the PLA, especially the Air Force, is exercising some new patterns of operation. And that kind of operations is quite sensitive. And so the PLA probably doesn't want the outside world to observe what it has been practicing. And I think so far that appears to be the most plausible account. The second one is that in March, China held 2 sessions, 2 very important political meetings. So during that period of time, the Chinese authority probably didn't want some incidents or accidents to happen. I mean, they also count as one mainstream explanation. But I think if that is the case, then we should be witnessing, a lot of free sorties and incursions after the mid-March.
Let's talk a bit about the US. While it was postponed due to the war with Iran, US President Donald Trump's visit to China is approaching once again. What do you expect from the Trump-Xi Jinping talks regarding Taiwan? And in general, how do you assess the Trump's administration China policy? Many observers argue that Trump hesitates to be truly tough on China.
I think that is really a big question, but we tend to discuss this from two somewhat different complementary accounts. First, on President Trump himself. Of course, I think in Taiwan, many people accept that President Trump's decision-making style is featured with transactionalism. According to this account, the fear is that in his meeting with President Xi, he may say something against Taiwan's interest if Xi Jinping is able to offer something the US wants. That is, of course, the biggest fear in Taiwan. And honestly speaking, it appears that we can't do anything about that. But on the other hand, the US foreign policy is hardly made solely by the president himself. So there is also some continuity when it comes to bureaucratic politics, when it comes to those professional officials and those staff and so on and so forth. So we also observe that despite or regardless of whatever President Trump may say or may not say about Taiwan and the cross-strait relations, the U.S. everyday policy about Taiwan, I think it enjoys a strong degree of continuity. So I think Taiwan still is in the U.S. vital interest, and securing the Taiwan Strait or safeguarding a regional order and peace, I think is still the U.S. and also President Trump's interest. So the question is, we don't really know how these two factors interact with each other, so whether it is the president's individual role that is more important or whether the continuity of U.S. policy. So that constitutes the most significant uncertainty now for the Taiwanese government.
Imagine you have this chance. What would be your advice for President Trump before the talks with Xi Jinping?
I would probably say that President Trump, I know that you think President Xi is one of your best friends and you enjoyed good relations with him. But again, President Xi cannot make policy on his own entirely. So, I mean, he has, the Communist Party, he has the Chinese Party state's interest to take care of. And so personal relations is one thing, but national interest is another. And I think if we take into consideration the importance of a U.S. national interest, I think peace and security across the Taiwan Strait remains on top of the U.S. List of national interest.
But let me put this more bluntly. In fact, many Europeans worry that the US president may be unwilling to help them in the event of Russian aggression. Does Taiwan have similar concerns regarding Trump's commitment to defend Taiwan?
Politically, we try to argue that Taiwan is vital when it comes to U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific. And so we have very reason to believe that the U.S. eventually will provide assistance to Taiwan if there is a Taiwan Strait contingency. But realistically, as you suggest, we should also be prepared for the worst scenario where, Taiwan stands alone and, Taiwan fights against the Chinese, the PLA alone. Yes, so this is our national security and defense policy so far. Yeah, so we hope that there will be U.S. assistance. But in reality, in our preparation, in our defense reforms and the mobilization of the society, the baseline is that we will fight and we will endure alone.
Do you believe Europe would help defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion?
The role of Europe in a Taiwan Strait contingency is debated, but from my point of view, I think Europe and the European powers can only play limited role if there is an armed conflict across the Taiwan Strait. And the reason is practical. It is not about whether you have political will or not. It is practical. If there is a crisis, even if Europe or some European countries want to support Taiwan militarily, the fact is that Taiwan and those powers and those militaries have never had the opportunity to train together, to communicate, right? So in a time of crisis, how would us communicate with each other? And arguably, we will need to do that through the US, right? Because NATO, right? So regardless of, distance, political will, military strength, and stockpile, and so on and so forth, I think communication alone will be an obstacle to overcome. So I think realistically speaking, our argument is that the role of Europe probably is not most evident in a time of armed crisis across the Taiwan Strait. I think Europe's assistance to Taiwan should be in the peacetime or in the gray zone. That is, for EU, European countries to work with Taiwan to push back those hybrid threats or gray zone operations in time such as today or, in peacetime before there is an armed conflict.
Junior, what do you think about this now, I would say, infamous prediction of 2027, that by that time Xi Jinping wants to be ready to invade Taiwan if necessary, basically using force? Doesn't mean he will do it, but what do you think about this prediction? Frankly speaking, I was always a bit cautious about this, and I don't know if it still has any merit, but it is still quite often repeated. So what's your take on this?
The short answer is that I don't think 2027 thesis is realistic. I don't expect an armed conflict in 2027. And I think one simple way to explain this is to look at three factors. Whether China will invade Taiwan. The first is the political will. And on that, we must assume that Xi Jinping has the political will to do so. The question is, under what conditions? I think in normal time, if President Xi is rational enough, then he should be informed that today is not the day. The other two conditions is that, one, President Xi becomes overconfident. And I think one possible factor is that after those purges of the PLA leadership, the new leaders within the PLA only want to report to President Xi what he wants to hear. And this will make him overconfident and miscalculate the situation in the Taiwan Strait. And the other condition is that President Xi finds himself to be too stressed. That is, China encounters huge social and economic press. And so this kind of pressure makes Xi Jinping wants to take Taiwan to transfer its domestic pressure. And I think luckily so far we can't see neither condition taking shape. So I think so far, we can still reasonably assume that President Xi and the Chinese leadership remains rational. So that is the first factor. The second is capability, and whether the PLA is capable of invading Taiwan. And I think if we look at the numbers of missiles, warships, fighter jets, and so on and so forth, the military balance between Taiwan and China, of course, is worsening, right? The gap is increasing. But invading Taiwan takes more than numbers. Taiwan is an island. So if China wants to invade Taiwan, one particular requirement is amphibious landing. And this remains quite difficult for China. And also nowadays, the Taiwan's defense policy has been moving towards urban warfare or urban guerrilla warfare. And the PLA or the Chinese writings on modern warfare acknowledges that urban warfare is by far the most complicated form in human history. I mean, when it comes to military capability, there's still some limits on the part of the PLA. And third is obstacles in execution. So even if China has the political will and even China believes that his military power is strong enough to invade Taiwan, there are still some problems to overcome. And the most important one is the U.S., the uncertainty of whether the U.S. will intervene and come to assist Taiwan. So that constitutes the single most important uncertainty for China, for any Chinese leader to make his own decision. And others include, for instance, regional countries' response. I mean, China not only has an issue with Taiwan, it also has territorial disputes from Japan all the way to many Southeast Asian countries and India. So how those countries will react in a time of Taiwan Strait crisis is also uncertain for China. And the third, of course, is international sanctions, right? As we have observed in the war in Ukraine. So I think put together, yes, the PLA is becoming more and more stronger and its behavior is, more and more aggressive. But I think war is not simply a matter of numbers. And so for China to invade Taiwan, there are still several issues to be overcome.
We already mentioned Europe. Do you foresee a potential strengthening of EU-Taiwan security ties? And if that happens, what would you say Beijing reaction would be?
The security ties between Taiwan and Europe have been improving. I think it is ongoing. And I think most of the areas are the so-called non-traditional or soft security issues, like countering FIMI or working on those dual-use technologies and space technologies and countering lawfare and so on and so forth. I mean, Taiwan has been working with individual European countries on some or all of those issues mentioned above. I think currently not only Taiwan needs some insights and assistance from those European countries, but we also have much to offer. I mean, especially when it comes to Chinese infiltration into this domestic society, united front work narrative or information warfare and so on and so forth. So I think based on mutual benefit, Europe and Taiwan will continue their security cooperation. And as for the implications for EU-China relations, my argument would be that China will be unhappy anyway. If Europe has any, substantial cooperation with Taiwan, I mean, China is never happy about this. We can foresee Chinese position to any security cooperation between Taiwan and Europe. But I think ultimately, such kind of cooperation should be based on mutual interest, regardless of what Chinese authority may think.
And finally, the last one, and you just visited Bratislava for the CE Forum. So why Central and Eastern Europe is not a homogeneous region? What added value can these countries provide to Europe-Taiwan relations?
Pragmatically speaking, Taiwan tries to enhance its relations with many, if not all, of the European countries. But I think Central and Eastern European countries play a significant role in the sense that, I mean, people from this region and Taiwan still carries the historical memory about, the threat from the communist regime. So it is not only physical coercion or military threat, but it also involves ideological differences and, those kind of pressure or infiltration. So I think the value and the common or similar historical memories are what makes Taiwan and Central and Eastern European countries similar in that regard. I think, of course, Taiwan still seeks to enhance its relations with the traditional or the big three. We also constantly tries to explore new space with CE countries.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe and listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. The link is in the episode description. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.